In every city, there are stories that never made the papers. Not because they weren't important, but because they were inconvenient. They live in forgotten files, in half-finished investigations, in questions no one wanted answered. This isn't where justice always wins. This is where the echoes remain. This is Reverberating Noir. Some stories don't end. They settle. Into the walls. Into the silence between heartbeats. Into the moment just before you reach for your glass. Welcome to Reverberating Noir.
Tonight we're going back, not to a crime scene wrapped in police tape, but to a bedroom. A Victorian bedroom in Balham, England. A man thrashing in his sheets. And a scream that has echoed for 150 years without ever finding an answer.
April the 18th, 1876. A barrister named Charles Bravo took to his bed complaining of stomach pains. By morning, he was dying. By the 21st, he was dead. And the person who killed him? Still unknown.
The case was called the Balham Mystery. 3 separate inquests, hundreds of witnesses, the finest legal and medical minds Victorian England could assemble, and at the end of all of it, an open verdict. Willful murder by some person or persons unknown.
That phrase, person or persons unknown, it's the most frightening sentence the law can produce, because it doesn't mean they didn't look, it means they looked, and the darkness looked back.
What makes this case genuinely unsettling isn't the poison, it's the architecture around the poison, the house, the relationships. The very specific way everyone in that building had reason to want Charles Bravo gone, and the very specific way none of them could be proven to have done it.
Let me set the stage, because the stage matters here. The Priory, a sprawling mansion on the edge of London, gas lamps, panelled walls, the kind of house that looks like respectability from the outside and feels like a held breath from within.
Florence Bravo was the mistress of that house, a wealthy heiress. Striking, complicated, and by any honest reading of the evidence, deeply unhappy. She had a past the newspapers couldn't leave alone. A long, open relationship with a man who'd lied about being married. Then a serious affair with Dr. James Manby Gully, a celebrated physician, decades her senior, whose reputation was immaculate.
And then she married Charles Bravo, 30 years old, a barrister with money and a temper. By multiple accounts, controlling, domineering, prone to rages that the servants heard through closed doors.
That detail matters. The servants could hear him, which means the servants knew. And in a Victorian household, servants were the invisible architecture. They moved through every room. They touched every surface. They saw everything and were expected to say nothing.
The 18th of April began like any other day at the Priory, except it didn't. Not really.
Bravo went into Balham village that morning and purchased a bottle of carbolic acid toothwash. He handed it to Florence, a small act of control dressed up as consideration. Then, and this is the detail that stops me every time Dr. Gully arrived at the house, unannounced.
The former lover. Walking through the front door of the home, his former mistress now shared with another man. That takes something. Courage or recklessness. Maybe both.
Florence and Mrs. Jane Cox, her companion, her confidant, the woman who ran the household's quiet machinery, they met with Gully privately. Bravo stayed away. What was said in that room? We have no record. Gully left before lunch. And whatever passed between them left no trace, except the fact that it happened at all.
Mrs. Cox, I want to stay on her for a moment, because she is the most quietly compelling figure in this entire case. A widow, financially dependent on Florence. Loyal, in a way that could read as devotion or as something more calculated. She was there when Bravo screamed. She was the first person in that room.
And she was the one who washed the glass. That detail was never satisfactorily explained. A glass of water, sitting on the nightstand, Bravo is convulsing. He is screaming about poison, and Mrs. Cox washes the glass. She said later it was habit, tidiness. The court found that answer insufficient. History has found it haunting.
That afternoon, before the night turned dark, Bravo had a screaming argument with his groom. George Griffiths. Missing hay. The kind of petty tyranny that Bravo apparently couldn't resist. He threatened dismissal. Loudly enough for the whole house to hear.
Griffiths worked with horses, which means Griffiths had routine access to antimony, a compound used in horse tonics. A compound that, in sufficient quantity, causes violent vomiting, intense thirst, and a slow, agonizing collapse over days. The same compound found in Charles Bravo's body.
Evening. Bravo retired early. He asked for cold meat and water. Just water, a glass brought by a maid at 9 in the evening, and then the screaming started.
"I have taken poison. Don't tell Florence." That was what he said to Mrs. Cox when she ran in. "Not help me, not get a doctor. Don't tell Florence."
What does a man mean when he says that? Is he protecting her? Is he afraid of her reaction? Is he, in the first seconds of terror, already constructing a story? Or is he telling us something about who he suspected and choosing, even in agony, to protect them?
The toxicological evidence that emerged later made everything worse. Dr. Thomas Stevenson, the leading forensic expert of the era, concluded that Bravo had been poisoned in multiple doses, possibly 3 separate administrations. This was not an impulsive act. This was not a moment of rage. This was patient, deliberate, repeated.
Someone in that house, or with access to that house, poisoned Charles Bravo on more than one occasion, walked past him, spoke to him, perhaps looked at him with concern, and then did it again.
That's the part that changes the case entirely, because it eliminates the idea of a crime of passion. What you're left with is premeditation. And premeditation requires nerve, access, and a very specific kind of coldness.
3 suspects. 3 people whose lives intersected with Charles Bravo in ways that gave them motive, access, or both. Florence, Mrs. Cox, Dr. Gully.
Florence had the clearest motive. Bravo's will gave her everything with one condition. She was never to see Dr. Gully again. And Gully had been at the house that very morning. If Bravo had found out, or if Florence feared he would, the financial stakes were suddenly very real. But antimony? Where would she obtain it? How would she administer it without being seen? The evidence was smoke, suggestive and shapeless.
Mrs. Cox had access. She had proximity. She washed the glass. She was the first person Bravo spoke to. And there was a note scrawled by Bravo before he lost consciousness that mentioned her bottle. Her bottle. Not Florence's. Not the maid's. Hers.
That note was never definitively interpreted. Bravo was delirious, feverish. His words could have been confusion, accusation, or the random firing of a dying mind reaching for the nearest name. But it exists! It was written in his hand! And it was never explained away.
And Gully, the respectable elder, the man whose career had survived scandal once barely, poisoning a romantic rival, it defied logic. It defied everything we know about how he operated. No evidence linked him to the antimony. No evidence placed him in the house after lunch. And yet he was there that morning. He was connected to Florence, and he had, perhaps, more to lose than anyone if Bravo lived and kept Florence isolated.
23 days of inquest, hundreds of pages of testimony, and the jury could not agree. The verdict: willful murder by some person or persons unknown. A second inquest months later reached the same wall. The system had done everything it could, and it wasn't enough.
I want to say something about what that means, not legally, but humanly. When a jury says person or persons unknown, they are not saying the crime didn't happen. They are not saying there was no killer. They are saying, we know this was done. We know it was deliberate. We know someone in that house, or connected to it, poisoned this man 3 times. And we cannot name them, because the evidence stops just short of certainty.
That gap between knowing and proving is where the case lives permanently, and it's worth asking why that gap existed, because it wasn't accidental. Someone managed that gap. Someone knew exactly how much to leave visible and how much to keep hidden.
The aftermath is where the case becomes something else entirely, something that moves beyond mystery into tragedy.
Florence Bravo was destroyed by the press. The newspapers painted her as calculating, cold, morally compromised. She was 31 years old. Within 2 years, she was dead. Officially from acute yellow atrophy of the liver. unofficially from the weight of everything that followed her out of that inquest room. Whether she knew who did it, whether she was responsible, whether she was simply a woman ground down by scandal and grief, we don't know. She took whatever she knew with her.
Dr. Gully's career ended. A man who had treated royalty, who had built a reputation across decades, reduced to obscurity. He died years later with his name still attached to the case, like a shadow he couldn't outrun.
And Mrs. Cox lived for decades after. Decades. I think about that sometimes. Whatever she knew, whatever she did or didn't do, she carried it for the rest of a long life. Every morning she woke up, every evening she went to sleep. And somewhere in the architecture of her days, that glass was still there.
Here's what I keep returning to. Charles Bravo was not a sympathetic victim. He was controlling. He was cruel in the small, grinding ways that don't leave bruises. He created a household where people feared him and resented him and had very specific reasons to want him gone. He built his own trap, and then someone used it.
That's the systemic pattern that makes this case more than a Victorian curiosity. The conditions for this crime were constructed over time. Not in one explosive moment, but in the accumulation of small cruelties, financial controls, social pressures, and a closed household where no one could speak freely. The poison was almost incidental. The real work had been done long before April the 18th.
And the system that was supposed to catch it, the law, the inquest, the medical testimony, it ran into the same wall every time, because the crime had been committed in the space between people. In whispered conversations, in washed glasses, in the gap between what was said and what was meant.
Victorian England trusted its institutions, trusted that the law could reach into a household and extract the truth. This case proved otherwise. And what's genuinely disturbing is that the conditions that allowed it closed, households, power imbalances, witnesses who had every reason to stay silent, those conditions didn't disappear with the gas lamps and the starched collars.
The Priory is gone now. Balham is a busy London suburb. The house where this happened doesn't exist anymore, except in the records and in the imagination of everyone who's ever read the case and felt that particular chill.
But the case itself, it doesn't resolve. Every serious examination of the evidence ends in the same place. Someone did this. Someone planned it, executed it across multiple administrations, and was never named. The most likely explanations all have gaps. The gaps were never filled. 150 years of examination and the verdict is still unknown.
There's a moment in the case that I find impossible to let go of. Bravo, in his final hours, oscillating between accusing poison and denying it. One moment pointing at the glass, the next blaming his own stomach, as though even dying. He wasn't sure he wanted to know, or wasn't sure he wanted anyone else to.
That ambivalence might be the most honest thing in the entire case, because sometimes people sense the answer before they have the evidence. And sometimes, knowing what the answer means, they choose not to arrive at it.
There's a particular kind of darkness that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with violence or noise. It moves quietly. It uses the ordinary, a glass of water, a trusted hand, a room you've slept in 100 times. Charles Bravo died in his own bed, in his own house, surrounded by people who knew him. And the person who put the poison in his body was never named, not because the investigators failed, but because whoever did this understood something the law didn't, that the most protected space in Victorian England was the space between people who knew each other well. That space is still protected. It always has been. If this case stayed with you, if the silence at the end of it felt familiar in a way you can't quite explain, then you're exactly who Reverberating Noir is made for. Subscribe. Stay with us, because the stories we tell here don't end when the episode does. They follow you. That's the point.
The question the Bravo case leaves open isn't really about antimony or water glasses or Victorian inheritance law. It's about proximity. About who had access to the most ordinary moments of a man's life and how long they'd been planning to use it. We never found out, and the reason we never found out is the most frightening part of all. Whoever did this simply waited, stayed calm, let the inquests run, let the newspapers burn through their suspects, and walked away into a long and ordinary life. As though nothing had happened, because for them nothing had.
The recording ends here, but the case doesn't. Somewhere, the evidence still exists. The questions still wait. If this story stayed with you, If it followed you into the silence, subscribe to Reverberating Noir. Not for us, for the stories that refuse to disappear.
Because as long as something doesn't make sense, the truth is still out there. And someone will find it.
Until next time, keep listening to the dark.